Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Can American engagement in the world survive the tensions between old memories of the Cold War and the new isolationism of America First? Let's get to the bottom line. If the United States is an empire, is it doing a good job of keeping its top dog status? Under the Democratic Party, American diplomacy talks about maintaining the global order, even though that order is over 80 years old, a relic of the Cold War, and left in tatters by earth-shattering events like Israel's war in Gaza and the Russia-Ukraine war. And under President Donald Trump's Republican Party, American diplomacy doesn't even bother talking about a world order. It's just America first. Globalization is a dirty word now, and the idea of spreading democracy is kind of laughable. So is there a third way for America's foreign policy? A new grand strategy that could keep America on top in the long term? Or is that just a lost cause? Today we're talking with former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, who's just come out with a new book, Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder. Michael, congratulations on your book just coming out. I've got it. And let me just get to the bottom line. Who's winning, the Autocrats or the Democrats?
Well, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me. Right now, I would say the Autocrats are in the ascendancy. They're becoming stronger over the last 30 years, China especially, but Russia too. Some democracies have flipped they're more autocratic today, so that's in the win column for the Autocrats. And then third, as I write about in the book, many of the old democracies in the world are both weaker in terms of all kinds of metrics, but they're also less democratic, including the United States of America. So the moment right now is not looking good for the Democrats, but I'm pretty optimistic in the long run that in the fight between Democrats and Autocrats, the Democrats will eventually prevail.
Now, you write in the book that you're a liberal internationalist at a time when illiberal nationalism is considered in vogue. Is your breed of thinking dying out?
Maybe. I don't know. I'm a political scientist, and we're not very good at predicting the future. Let me say I was in the government for 5 years, and the CIA was not very good at it either. But I do know a couple of things. One, we've been through periods like this before. The worst, of course, was in the 1930s, when people like me were considered old-fashioned and out of style, and fascists and communists were rising in terms of their ideology. And we got down to, I think, 12 democracies in the world then. That was a pretty bad time for liberal internationalists. The 60s and early 70s also were not such a great time. That was a time when Marxist-Leninist regimes were taking all over the world, taking hold, Southeast Asia, Angola, Mozambique, then Nicaragua, even close to home, Afghanistan, and we seem to be fading. The liberal free world. By the way, there was a lot of polarization inside the United States as well. So that seemed like a pretty dark time for the ideas that I think best serve America's national interests abroad. 15 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. So that gives me hope that we've been through these periods before. We might be at it again. But if my ideas about how to best advance America's security interests and American prosperity and American values in the world are to gain the ascendancy, we have to make the argument in a more sophisticated way, and we have to change the argument. So, we use these labels, liberal internationalists. Those are big, elastic terms that, you use the word liberal in a lot of parts of America, and they immediately associate it with other things than what I associate classic liberalism with. Right. So my idea is not just to go back to the glory days of the 1990s, but to tweak the way we've been engaging the world that I think is better than pulling back and isolationist tendencies, that I think is better than doing things by ourselves, going it alone. I think it's better to have allies and to participate in the multilateral organizations. And I think it's better to have values as part of American foreign policy and not just act like the other autocracies in the world. In the long run, I don't think that best serves America's national interests.
And a lot of people go back to the Iraq War during when the Bush administration happened as one of the fundamental blind spots among U.S. foreign policy hands, that they don't understand how the rest of the world saw that moment of a staggering level of hypocrisy for the U.S. at the top of its game. And I'm just wondering, if America was the king of its own hill, did it kick down its own hill? And I just get the sense that you believe it did, but I want to hear it from you.
So the quick answer is yes. But the long answer is important. And I actually go through the long answer in the substance of the book. The powers on chapter, the powers on ideology, and the chapters on competing conceptions of the global order all start around 1991-92, and then go through the 3 decades where we squandered American power. We lost this battle of ideas back, 33 decades ago, 30 years ago. Everybody seemed like they wanted to be a democratic country. And then third, we did have something called the liberal international order for a time. I think the peak of that was when the world got together to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. And we did that through the UN Security Council, and the Soviets and the Chinese and the Americans, we were all aligned. And now today we're not, right? And so I go through all of that and the mistakes we made. And you articulated just right now some of the biggest ones. So the first one is on China. This notion that they just rose and we had nothing to do with it is completely absurd. We all were in that together. A lot of American companies, a lot of American banks made billions and billions and billions of dollars, sometimes at the expense of American workers, in cahoots with the Chinese Communist Party. That is true. And there was this theory that modernization of China economic modernization would lead to political liberalization, right? It's an old famous theory. A guy named Marty Lipset, Professor Marty Lipset, used to teach at Stanford before passing away, wrote that article in 1959, just so you know how far back it goes. And whether it was an excuse to do business or people actually believed it, it was an animating idea 30 years ago. It turned out not to be true, or at least not true yet. And that's where we are with China. With Russia, it was a little different. With Russia, the Soviet Union collapsed. It was a euphoric period. I was living there. I went back after the collapse of the Soviet Union to work for an American NGO that promoted democracy. It's called the National Democratic Institute. And I want to be clear, we weren't there to overthrow the regime like Putin wants you to believe. We were invited by the Russian government to be there because there were a lot of small D Democrats in Russia at the time that wanted to build democracy. But we didn't do enough. We thought this was going to be just an inevitable process. We didn't provide enough economic assistance, welfare to the Russians enduring the economic depression that they had in the 1990s, and that came to backfire. But then third, Steve, I'm glad you mentioned the Iraq War, because that's a theme in my book. We did overreach in that war, and the world did react. I can tell you, I was the U.S. ambassador in Moscow in the Obama years. And anytime I said anything critical about Russia's behavior at home or abroad, I got back to me, what about Iraq? What about Iraq? What about Iraq? This whataboutism. And that overextension, and had we done it with the UN Security Council behind us, it might have been different, but they weren't behind us. Two of our allies, France and Germany, weren't behind us. And that, I think, had consequences for the way the rest of the world looks at us, just like what the Trump administration is doing today, blowing up ships in the Caribbean with no evidence to the rest of the world that these are actual terrorists. That undermines our reputation in the world broadly. And I just think it's an imprudent strategy for pursuing our long-term national interests.
Another element of the kind of geostrategic chessboard that a lot of folks in the Middle East watch is what's been going on with Gaza and Israel. A lot of the world is looking at and saying, hey, you have these great, important international institutions, International Court of Justice, others that have kind of been weighing in on this, the United Nations. And the United States seems unable to come around it. But I think when it comes then to the test of, a humanitarian ethic, an understanding of rule of law, of the importance of, justice or sort of a horizon for people in the end. How do you think the U.S. has been handling that? And do you worry that as we shift from a world of Democrats to autocrats, and maybe even the United States, what's that going to look like?
Yeah, great questions that I don't have easy answers for. First, start with the immediate news in the Middle East, and then let's broaden out to the bigger picture. So I applaud the president that he got the hostages out and he ended the war in Gaza. That war went on way too long. Too many people died, and that we have a ceasefire, even though it's being violated, is better than we were a month ago. But the problem is we gotta now win the peace, and just cutting a deal, ending the fighting, and then walking away will not work. And that gets me to the second part of your question. I believe that it's in America's interest to participate in multilateral organizations, multilateral institutions, some of the ones that you just described, because I think that benefits us. But I also think it benefits the world in terms of stability and humanity. And the attitude that the current administration has now, which is to pull out of these agreements, right? Trump did it in his first term, and now he's doing it again in his second term. I don't think is going to make the United States better off. I think one of the real genius ideas of 1945 and even before, with Bretton Woods, when that started, was that American leaders back then thought if we embedded the United States as maybe the leading country in the world, but as an anchor to this multilateral system, it would not only be good for us, but good for the world, good for our allies, and back then good for the free world, right? It united the free world against the communists. And I just think this notion that we can act like cowboys and we can bully whoever we want and we're going to get our way, it can work in the short term. And it can work against small countries that have no choice. But let me tell you, they don't like it. Panama doesn't like it when we're bullying them. The Danes don't like it when we threaten to invade Greenland. The Canadians, I grew up on the Canadian border in Montana, and I have a lot of Canadian friends. They sure don't like it when people joke about making them the 51st state. And so, yeah, they'll take it if they have to in the calculation of their own national interests, but they don't like it, and eventually they'll defect because we're not the only superpower in the world today. There's options for a lot of countries in the world, and that's China first and foremost. And secondly, when it comes to powerful countries like China, bullying doesn't work. And I think we see that playing out right now. President Trump came in and put on a bunch of tariffs and said we're going to push around the Chinese. Well, Xi Jinping pushed back. And so I'm glad we got to some kind of new equilibriums, and we kind of pulled back from the worst case racing to the bottom in this tit for tat that we were in. But I don't think that was a good look for the United States. I don't think it enhanced our reputation. And I think it'll make us weaker when we go to try to negotiate other deals around the world. So being a member of the international system, I think is better than trying to be the cowboy outside of it.
But then when you look at the level of tariffs imposed on India, or you look at other parts of the world that you would need in some sort of structure to deal with the sheer size of China and how it is so integrated now with economies throughout the world, how can the United States and how can this White House think that it could do that without greater partnerships, and thus I would assume better trade relations with potential partners in that effort, like India, like Europe, like other places? Are we shooting ourselves in the foot in dealing with what you consider to be the most significant existential threat to the American order?
There's a debate in Washington. Are we in a new Cold War with China or not? And my answer is yes. And then my second answer is no. And if that sounds complicating and confusing, that's why my book is such a substantive book. I won't tell you how long it is, but it's a big book because I think we have to have a proper diagnostics of what is similar and what is different. And I actually think there are similarities, two great powers, ideological competition, competition all over the world, and tragically, it'll probably last for decades like the Cold War did. But there are also differences. And if we don't acknowledge those differences, I think we're going to make mistakes. So our economies are intertwined. Difference from the Soviet Union, we didn't have that. China's economy, as you just said, is highly intertwined with the rest of the world. Soviets didn't have that. And if we think we're going to, break off and bring, the free world with us, I think we're going to fail. Another difference, and this is very controversial, I know, but this is my take now, and I reserve the right to change if the evidence changes, and that'll change my mind. But I do not believe the ideological competition with China today is as intense as it was with the Soviets during the Cold War. And I think when we say that they want to make the whole world Marxist-Leninist and autocratic and overthrow the United States, I just don't see the evidence for that. And I don't think they have the capabilities anyway, but that's a difference. And we have to be careful not to overreact and try to globally contain everything that China does, because A, we don't have to. Sometimes we can cooperate with them. And B, we don't have the resources to do that today. And so trying to do so will lead to failure.
Michael, I want to show you a quick graph about how Americans look at democracy in the United States and whether it's working for them. It's a January Gallup 2025 poll. Look at these numbers. What you see is in 1984, 61% of Americans were satisfied with the way democracy was working. By 2025, that had fallen to 34%. And you hold out at hope at the end of your book that democracy is still on its legs, that it could come back. What do we need to do to turn these numbers around about how Americans themselves see what democracy is doing and how they fit into it?
Yeah. Again, really hard question, and I don't pretend to have easy answers. But I'd say two things first, and then a few other things to add about America specifically. So, I'm basically still with Churchill, and I'm just paraphrasing, but yeah, democracy, it's a horrible system of government, except for all the others tried. And I think when you say democracy isn't working, you got to have a counter proposal. You just can't say this is failing for me. Well, what's the alternative? And I think all the alternatives are worse. It's just depressing to me to see the way fellow Americans talk about each other. We had periods like that, again, late 60s, early 70s in America, but not like today. And there are two things. I mean, I go through all the institutional changes we could do if I were, able to have super majorities in Congress and had the president's ear. There are things we could do to reduce polarization in America. One, campaign finance laws need to be changed. We just can't have the billionaires controlling everything. Two, this redistricting, where it's just the primaries that matter. If we got back to a more rational system, we'd have more competition. Three, I know this is going to sound crazy to some, but the Electoral College is bad for democracy. It leads to polarization. It leads to presidential elections where only a small minority of Americans play a role in that. And I'm from the state of California. I think people need to remember there are millions of Republicans who voted for President Trump in the last election who live in California who had no attention from the presidential election because it was written off. That needs to be changed. Media, way too polarized, if we could change that. But those are big, hard structural things. The first thing that needs to change is our leadership. And I'm sorry, but we have leaders that thrive on polarization. They thrive on calling their enemies of the state that need to be arrested. And the first and foremost thing we have to do is stop that. That is what has driven polarization over the last 20 years. I'm from Montana, and I worked on the Barack Obama campaign. I think your viewers would be surprised to know that Barack Hussein Obama, in one of the reddest states in America, allegedly, where there are no African Americans, by the way, with a very small minority. I'm just paraphrasing what Obama used to say about Montana. He really wanted to win in Montana. He won 47% of the vote in the state of Montana in 2008. McCain only got 2,000. He won 49%. And I tell you that because social scientists who study American politics more closely than they'll tell you preferences don't change radically, and most certainly not within a generation. They change over generations. So the basic preferences, we're more purple than red and blue, but our elites have pushed us into these other camps. And so now we need new leaders that will push us more towards the center and less towards making our enemies sound like they're literally our enemies. Let's debate tax policy. Let's debate welfare policy. That's fine. But we shouldn't be debating about the democratic rules of the game.
Let me ask you finally, at the Aspen Security Forum, I had the privilege of interviewing someone who's a Republican foreign policy leader, Condoleezza Rice, former Secretary of State. You know her well, but you're on different sides of the political line. But she says something that could really be a forward to your book. She says, I often say, these are her words, that the four horsemen of the apocalypse are populism, nativism, isolationism, protectionism, and they tend to ride together. It's a very powerful framing of this moment by a senior Republican foreign policy voice. And so as you look at this, and you look around the world at the rise of populism in this moment, which often means a disregard for others, right? A focus on one's own needs and citizens, which is fine, but a disregard for the broader system. In your experience, Mike, what brings that to a different realization? How does that come to a different order?
We can agree on what's in American national interest, not Republican or Democratic national interests. And I do think there is a center there that we need to resurrect. And I use the word Goldilocks a lot in this new book, because on a lot of foreign policy issues, I do think it's the extremes that have gotten us in bad problems. It's the center, and a kind of sophisticated, nuanced strategy is what we need, for instance, to compete with China. Without that, we're going to fail. How do we get back to that? I don't know. I know my job is, I wrote a book about it, and I have lots of policy prescriptions. And now I'm going to talk to as many people as I can, both in America and around the world, about these ideas, because I think the ideas are first and foremost for Americans and how we should act in the world. But I also think there's a lot of lessons there for other countries in interacting with the United States. And I say that because I think for too long, American foreign policy elites just talked amongst each other. You know, we went to all the same conversations in Washington and all the think tanks, and we left the American people out of that. And that created space for the populists that Condi is talking about in that quote. And so I want to get back in that space and push back on it.
Well, Ambassador Michael McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, professor of political science at Stanford University, and now author of Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for this book.
Thanks for having me. Fantastic conversation.
So what's the bottom line? After the Great Flu outbreak around the world in 1918, many nations in the world wanted to wall themselves off from each other. They tilted towards autocracies and against democracies, which always tend to be more chaotic and slow to make decisions as compared to the clarity of really powerful leaders. It's interesting that after COVID, we've seen a rise in populist leaders, not just here in the United States, but around the world. Big global joint projects are largely out now, and nationalistic projects seem to be in. Every country for itself. World War II is an ancient memory. No one remembers why the world decided to work cooperatively on global needs. For now, America is taking a vacation from do-good projects around the world. So say hello to a new world that's less predictable and way more messy. Ambassador McFaul still hopes that it's just a phase, and this country will eventually work out a new and different global order, but that's anybody's guess. And that's the bottom line.